Simply put, arrow functions are just an alternative way of creating functions in JavaScript. They allow you to accomplish the same things that regular functions allow you to do, like define a block of logic that you want to execute multiple times in different places in your application. But it's important to note that arrow functions are slightly different from regular functions, and in this video we're going to explore some of those differences by taking a look at arrow functions anatomy, understanding how they work, and answer the question of why do we prefer using arrow functions over regular functions in many cases in web development. What's up, I'm Ijemma. Welcome back to my channel where I talk about JavaScript and web development. Before we jump into this video, I'm working on the Igbo API or Igbo Dictionary project. If you're interested in contributing to an open source project, I have some links for volunteer forms down in the description box below. So if you're interested, take a look. Before we can understand how to create arrow functions, let's take a look at a regular function expression. So with this example, I created a function using the function keyword and then provided the name of my function, again, which is greetPerson. Inside parentheses, I list out the arguments that I expect to receive in my greetPerson function, which again is my person object. This is the standard look of a function in JavaScript. If you're just learning the language, you probably are using this syntax. So now that we understand how to create regular functions, let's see how we can convert this function into using arrow functions. So in this code block example, instead of creating a function named greetPerson, what I'm actually doing is creating a new variable called greetPerson, which is getting assigned the value of our new arrow function. So instead of using the function keyword to define our function, our arrow function starts off with parentheses listing all arguments that are expected. And then after our arguments, we use the equal and less than signs to create an arrow. And after our arrow, we open our function block scope with curly braces, and then the rest is just defining the function logic. So the major difference between a regular function and an arrow function is how they start off, where a regular function uses the function keyword and arrow functions use an arrow. So that's a pretty standard example of an arrow function. You create an anonymous arrow function and then assign it to a variable, and that variable can be used just like any other regular function, where you call it by using parentheses and passing in parameters. But it's important to note that arrow functions are still slightly different from regular functions, and there are different ways that you can interact and work with arrow functions. So I'm going to go through a couple of quick examples to show you how you can construct arrow functions in different ways. So first off, you can define arrow functions actually without any parentheses if you only have one argument. So in this code block example, I have my first argument and then my arrow and then my open curly braces. What's going on here is that I'm creating an anonymous arrow function that's expecting one argument called firstArg, and then inside the curly braces I can define my function logic. If I had a single line of logic that returns a value that I wanted to return from my arrow function, I can actually omit my curly braces. So with this example, I have my first argument getting passed into my arrow function, and then I do first argument times 2 without any curly braces. What's going on here is that when I call this arrow function, I'm going to return the value of firstArg times 2. I didn't have to use a return keyword or even use curly braces. You can even use parentheses to capture a value that might require multiple lines to write. So in this code block example again, I'm taking in my first argument, and then my arrow function is using a ternary operator to decide what type of value should be returned. If should return arg is true, then it's going to return my first argument. If it's false, then it's going to return nothing. But if your arrow function had no arguments or more than one argument, then you'll need to use parentheses so JavaScript can actually parse your code. So in this code block example, since I'm passing in no arguments, I have to use parentheses and then my arrow function, and I can define my function logic. Or in this case, where I have two arguments, where I have first arg and second arg, and I have to use parentheses so JavaScript can tell that I'm passing in arguments into my arrow function. And just like regular function expressions, you can make asynchronous functions by using the async keyword. So with this example, I'm using the async keyword right before my parentheses to make it async. And again, just like regular functions, I can also assign default values to my arguments. So in this code block example, I'm assigning a default value to my first argument and then printing out my first argument. And again, just like regular function expressions, I can use rest parameters. So if I wanted to catch all the arguments that were passed into my function, I can use the triple dots and then use rest to catch all of my function's arguments. Arrow functions really do feel like regular functions by the end of the day, even though they're slightly more limited in comparison to regular functions. When it comes to actually constructing them and expecting to get arguments and handling arguments, it feels like a regular function. But if you want to learn more about arrow functions and all the tiny differences that it offers in comparison to regular functions, I'm going to link to the MDM documentation for the future. But now we have to answer the question of why would I ever use arrow functions over regular functions? They feel like they're one and the same. Well, it's important to note that although arrow functions do feel like regular functions, they're slightly different. The biggest difference between arrow functions and regular functions is that arrow functions don't bind to the global this variable. I'm going to walk you through an example to explain this a little bit better. So in this code block example, I have a person object that has full name, age, and speak. So you can notice for the speak key, I'm assigning an anonymous arrow function. And inside that anonymous arrow function, I'm printing out hi, I'm, and then referencing full name and age using the this keyword. So if you scan through this block of code, in your mind, what you expect to happen is when you call person.speak, you're expecting to read, hi, my name is Ijemma and I'm 50 years old. So in this case, this should be referring to my person object, so I can grab access to the other keys available in this object. But when I call person.speak, I actually get a malformed string where my name and age get replaced with undefined since JavaScript was unable to find those values. Even though what I wrote made sense conceptually, I used the wrong function expression, which made it impossible for JavaScript to reach the value that I was trying to reference. The reason for this is that arrow functions don't bind to the local scope, this variable, so this doesn't actually have a helpful value. Now let's see how a regular function would fare in the same situation. So again, I have my person object with full name, age, and speak, but instead of an anonymous arrow function, I just create an anonymous regular function. And then inside the function, I have the same logic of printing out hi, my name is, with references using the this variable. Now when I call person.speak, we can actually now see that my string is properly formatted and has the right values injected, where my name and age are getting printed out. This works because function expressions bind to this in the nearest local scope, and the nearest local scope in this example is our person object. So this is actually referring to or pointing to person. In most cases, you might not even find yourself having to refer or rely on the this variable, but it's important to understand how arrow functions and regular functions differ in that aspect. But that's it on arrow functions. Let me know if you have any questions by leaving a comment below or sending me a DM on Twitter. You can also ask me questions about JavaScript, web development, or anything in between. Also, before I go, quick shout out again to the Igbo API and Igbo dictionary project that I'm working on. Again, if you're interested, please go down to the description box below and fill out the volunteer form. Any help would be much appreciated. And with that being said, I'll see y'all in the next one.